Lesson 1. The nature of systems. In this lesson, we'll talk about what systems are, how we define it. We talk about how systems behave, what patterns of behavior do they demonstrate, and how do we identify or understand systems in real life. What's their nature, why they fail, and what keeps us from seeing them. Almost everyone and everywhere you get people saying systems and systems and systems. But what are systems? To begin to understand what systems are, let's go through a few examples. In this slide, we get to see some pictures of things. We get to see the human body, a toaster, the Amazon River, a football team, and a bowl of mixed fruits. In this set of pictures, we get to see a database, a kitchen, a toolbox, and a person who's fond of collecting stamps. The first set of pictures, with the human body and the toaster and the football, they all can be considered systems, while the second set of pictures demonstrate what we call a collection. People oftentimes get confused that there's a difference between having a collection and having a system. So what is a system? A system would be anything that is made up of parts or groups where these parts and groups are interacting, interrelated, interdependent, and form a complex, unified whole that has a purpose. Imagine a flock of birds that seem to be able to fly in synchronicity or in tune with each other, and seemingly having a way or a direction by which they all go to. More formally, when we talk about systems, the system itself can be made up of many systems, and that the interaction of these systems could lead to a more complex and dynamic relationships. These systems are situated in an environment where the surrounding itself also interacts with your system. It is influenced by the surrounding, the environment, and it is bounded by its structure or its form, and the system itself would now express how it will attain its purpose through its structure. When we look at these examples of quote-unquote systems, a good set of characteristics to use would be: number one, they have a clear purpose or intention. All the parts must be present for the system to be able to achieve its purpose. The parts by which they are arranged also affects the performance of the system, and how the parts are connected affects the overall results. It also has an inherent ability to maintain its stability via a feedback. A feedback is something that is internal and existing in the system that allows itself to manage itself. When we look at systems, we see systems as something that's alive, and that with the systems themselves, they create what we call a behavior, and the behavior is something we would like to be able to understand. Most of the time, when we talk about how systems behave, we often use the word systemic or inherent. And therefore, when we talk about systems, we see something similar in which systems tend to behave. In general, systems tend to behave dynamically. It is something that they tend to evolve and change over time. It is never static, even if it appears to be so. It is important to look at the system's behavior over time to see its pattern. Systems create patterns of behavior over time, and therefore the challenge is to be able to step back and see the totality of the behavior rather than focusing on individual events. When we talk about behaviors of systems, here are the more common modes of patterns you see. These are the exponential growth, a goal-seeking pattern, an oscillating pattern, an S-shaped growth, an S-shaped growth with overshoot, and an overshoot and collapse pattern. These patterns are the basic patterns you see in any systems, and eventually you get to see how these patterns can combine and create a more complex pattern that the system is demonstrating. An exponential growth is a typical pattern where the rate of increase is constant, resulting to a doubling of the value over time. Examples of this would be population, where we talk about population explosion, or even if you put money or invest in a bank where your interest is earning compoundingly. The larger the quantity, the larger the increase. Examples of this are shown on the right side based on some of the past data that you can see on how things have increased exponentially and how they can actually evolve and speed up the process of growth. A goal-seeking pattern is one where the rate in which the behavior of the system generally decreases as it approaches its goal. You don't observe a constant rate, but rather a slowing down that stops at the moment or almost at the moment it reaches its goal. Examples of this where you look at a plant where it grows fast and then slows down as the moment it reaches its maturity. An oscillating pattern is the one where you can see a overshoot and then suddenly goes down and goes back up, and it tries to achieve a certain level of a goal where thereby the system tries to make some corrective actions, and as it tries to take actions, it sometimes goes up the goal or goes below the goal. The state of the system constantly overshoots its goal or equilibrium state and then undershoots and so on. Usually the overshooting arises from the presence of delays in time where information is received by the decision maker. An S-shaped growth is another pattern where it's actually a hybrid of both an exponential pattern and a goal-seeking pattern, where you see a strong growth and rise, and then suddenly it slows down. Growth tends to be exponential, and when a limiting constraint is achieved, the growth is now limited. Eventually, one of these unseen constraints will tend to hold or stop the growth process. An S-shaped growth with overshoot is a pattern where you can see an exponential growth and then it reaches to a point that it starts oscillating. Oftentimes, again, the system with this kind of a pattern experiences significant time delays. These delays create the possibility of the system to overshoot and oscillate around a limiting constraint as it tries to achieve some form of equilibrium or stability. Finally, the overshoot and collapse is a typical pattern that we see in almost any applications in business and other areas. The overshoot and collapse shows a growth and a decline of a system. Such a system does not reach an equilibrium, but rather ultimately experiences a demise. This is a typical pattern for most of how you see products or organizations that eventually, when they rise and eventually fall. Other modes of behavior that we often use to describe systems would be a constant behavior or stasis or equilibrium. This does not mean that the system is not moving or alive, but rather the change is too slow for us to see over time, for us to see something meaningful in it. Randomness is another term we use to describe the behavior, which simply measures our ignorance that we don't know what these are, and therefore we call them random. We don't really know that they're random, we just don't know why they behave that way. Chaos, on the other hand, is something more complex. A chaotic system fluctuates irregularly, never the same and repeating, even though its motion is completely deterministic, which means that you can pretty much tell when chaos happens, but how chaos can happen within each of those time periods may be somewhat random, but chaos by itself is not random. These are irregular shocks that comes in endogenously, meaning something inside that eventually comes out and is not created by random shocks. So knowing what systems are, how systems behave, how do we now understand systems and how we see systems ourselves? According to many literature, the nature of systems and its behavior are as follows. It tends to be dynamic and therefore all is change. The components are tightly coupled, meaning they're interconnected, and you cannot do just one thing without affecting the other. Remember the concept of as the butterfly flies in the Amazon, it creates a ripple effect somewhere else. Third, a system is governed by feedback. Our decisions alter the state of the world. Things behave in what we call a non-linear way. The effects are rarely proportional, and therefore it creates a more growing effect over time. History is dependent, and therefore you cannot change things that had been done. As they say, you cannot unscramble the eggs once you've beaten them up. Systems are also self-organizing. Dynamics is generated inside the system because of its structure. It is also adaptive because systems are made up of people who change over time. A system is also counterintuitive. Sometimes we think we know how it behaves and then it surprises us because we tend to be too focused on the systems rather than the underlying reasons or intentions of the system. Systems are also policy resistant. Many obvious solutions fail or worsen the situation. When we thought that we know the right answer, it acts in a different way. It is also characterized by trade-off. There are policies that can cause worse to better behaviors first, where things had to go through a bad situation before getting better, while low leverage policies that seem to be easy to do, will eventually create a worse performance. In spite of our many best intentions, which I think most people do have, even the best solutions fail. And how we see the systems affects or determines the nature or quality of our ideas. In general, systems fail because it actually fails to achieve its purpose. The parts that we often set up or build or assembled in organization or a process are poorly designed or poorly connected. We expect them to be connected on its own. The system we build up oftentimes are very sensitive to external shocks that when something happens outside of the system itself is knocked off course. It inherently is also incapable of meeting its purpose, even though it tries to adjust. This means that its ability to deliver what is expected is not possible. And finally, the policies that we designed themselves are bad and does not promote the system's achievement of its goal. In spite of our many experiences, how come we are still unable to fully understand or comprehend systems? Here are some barriers of learning where we cannot fully comprehend the nature of the systems. Number one, the dynamic complexity, the behavior, the interactions are not easy to comprehend. We often get limited information so that we don't know the real facts behind it. We also experience what we call confounding or confusing relationships among the variables and therefore are oftentimes not clear or ambiguous. We are also practicing what we call bounded rationality. Bounded rationality is our own understanding of things, and they're bounded by our own perspectives, which in a way would create what we call a misperception of the feedback. Oftentimes you've heard people who mention that their biases affect their own views. We also have a flawed cognitive map, or oftentimes we call this as a mental model when you talk about Peter Senge's The Fifth Discipline. We also have erroneous inferences about the dynamics. We don't understand the behavior and we make the wrong conclusion about its behavior. We also practice unjustified reasoning, or what we call errors and biases, our logic, the way we argue. We also have defensive routines or interpersonal impediments to learning, where we believe that things can't be or things can be based on our own personal belief. And finally, it's often hard to understand systems if we have also experienced only failures and not seeing successes. And oftentimes understanding system behavior from failures doesn't really give you a complete understanding of what the system is capable of doing. Key messages that I'd like you to take away from this lesson. A system is a collection of parts that interact together to achieve a common purpose. Oftentimes, systems demonstrate a pattern over time. And finally, we tend to act even if we fail to see or understand the complexity of the system. And therefore, it fails to give us a better understanding of what systems are.